The first time the sirens came up the valley, they didn't sound urgent. They echoed slow and lazy off the canyon walls, the way noise does when it doesn't expect resistance. I was standing on my porch with a mug of burnt coffee, watching fog lift off the river like a long breath. Pine sap and wet dirt filled the air. The cabin boards creaked as they always did in the morning, complaining about the cold. When I realized those sirens were climbing, not passing through, something in my stomach tightened in a way I wouldn't understand until much later. Here's the part most people don't believe when I tell them how it all started. I didn't panic. I didn't run. I didn't grab papers or call a lawyer. I just stood there and listened, counting the seconds between echoes, the way my father taught me to count thunder. That valley has a rhythm, and if you live long enough inside it, you can hear when something doesn't belong. The police cruisers came into view at the bend where the road narrows and the river pinches close. Gravel popped under their tires. Radios hissed. One deputy killed his siren before they even reached the gate, like he already knew this wasn't going to be dramatic. The other left his lights spinning, red and blue cutting through the trees like an accusation. I remember thinking, very clearly, this is the day it stops being quiet. The deputy with the clipboard didn't look at me at first. He looked at the cabin, at the smoke coming out of the chimney, at the stacked firewood. He looked the way men do when they've been told a story before they arrive, and they're searching for proof that it's true. The second deputy stayed back by the car, hand resting on his belt, eyes moving over the land like he was measuring something. "Sir," Clipboard said finally, "we got a call about an illegal structure and possible trespassing." I laughed once without meaning to. It came out dry. The sound surprised both of us. "Possible trespassing on whose land?" I asked. He shifted, uncomfortable. "That's what we're here to determine." That was the moment I knew this wasn't random. Nobody just wakes up and calls the cops on a cabin that's been standing for 50 years unless someone tells them to. And I already knew who that someone was. Her name was Marlene Cutter, but nobody in the valley called her that. They called her Karen long before it became a meme, long before the haircut became a punchline. She'd moved in with the Homeowners Association 2 ridges over, the kind of development that advertises rustic charm and then bulldozes it flat. Gated entry, stone signs, uniform mailboxes, rules printed in glossy binders. I'd seen her once at the general store, tapping her nails on the counter, complaining about mud on the road. My road. The only road in or out of the valley. That morning, while the deputies asked me questions they already had answers for, Marlene was probably standing on her deck, arms crossed, watching through binoculars, convinced she'd finally flushed me out. I told them my name. I told them how long the cabin had been there. I told them my family had been in that valley before the county drew lines on a map. Clipboard nodded, wrote things down, and asked for documentation. "Sure," I said and went inside. The cabin smelled like old paper and coffee grounds. The floor dipped near the stove. I opened the cedar chest my grandfather built and pulled out a folder wrapped in oilcloth. Deeds, plats, surveys, all yellowed and stubborn, the kind of paperwork that doesn't age so much as harden. When I came back out, the deputy's eyebrows went up. He didn't read everything. He didn't need to. He just needed enough to realize he'd been sent on a fool's errand. "This call came from the HOA, he said carefully. "They claim your access road crosses their property." I pointed down the slope where the road cut through the trees, following the river like a scar. "That road existed before their property did." Clipboard looked at me then, really looked. The kind of look men give when they sense there's a story they weren't told. They left without issuing anything. No citation, no warning, just an awkward apology and a promise to note the file. As the cruisers pulled away, the valley swallowed the sound again. Birds came back, wind moved through the pines, everything went back to normal on the surface. But I knew better. That night rain came hard and fast, drumming on the tin roof like fists. I sat at the table with the folder open, the lamp casting a tight yellow circle over ink and signatures. My father's handwriting was there. My grandfather, S. Names of men long dead who had cut that road with picks and horses because there was no other way out. I'd come back to the cabin after my dad passed, thinking I'd fix it up, maybe rent it out in the summer, maybe just breathe for a while. I was tired. Tired of contracts and deadlines and fluorescent lights. The valley had always been the place where noise went to die. But Marlene and her HOA had other plans. Within a week, letters started arriving, certified, threatening, accusing me of violating covenants I'd never signed, codes I'd never agreed to, environmental regulations that somehow didn't apply to the 47 identical houses they dropped onto the ridge like toys. They claimed my septic was illegal, my water line was unpermitted, my cabin was a safety hazard. Each letter ended with the same polite threat: comply or face legal action. Here is something most people don't know. HOAs don't actually have power unless you give it to them. They operate on intimidation, on the assumption that you don't know where their authority ends. Marlene knew that too. She just didn't expect me to know it better. The calls escalated. County inspectors showed up unannounced. Surveyors tried to pound stakes into my meadow. Once I found a flyer taped to my gate warning about unsafe conditions and restricted access. That one made me angry enough to shake. I drove down to the county office with the folder on the passenger seat and waited in line under buzzing lights. The clerk flipped through my documents, frowning, then disappeared into the back. When she came out, her tone had changed. "Oh," she said softly, "you're that property." That's when the doubt crept in. Not about whether I was right, but about whether being right would be enough. I lay awake at night listening to wind rattle the windows, imagining courtrooms and fees and years of fighting. I wasn't rich. I couldn't afford to bleed money just to prove a point. The smear campaign started quietly, posts on neighborhood boards about that guy up the valley, rumors about meth labs and illegal hunting. One morning, I found fresh tire tracks near the river where someone had turned around too close to the water like they were checking something. I kept my head down. I documented everything, dates, times, names. I photographed survey flags and letters and tire tracks. I made coffee and watched the fog lift and reminded myself that patience had built this valley, not force. The turning point came on a gray afternoon when a county engineer named Lewis stopped by. He was younger than I expected, rain slicking his hair, boots already muddy. "I'm not here to cite you," he said quickly, like he needed me to know that first. "I'm here because something about this didn't sit right." We walked the road together. The river was high, brown, and loud. He pointed out culverts, grades, drainage patterns. "Who maintains this?" he asked. "I do," I said. "Always have." He stopped near the bend, staring uphill toward the HOA ridge where freshly cut slopes bled red clay into the trees. "They've been dumping runoff into your watershed," he said quietly, "and they're claiming this is their access." He didn't say anything else, but he didn't have to. I felt the pieces start to align, heavy and inevitable. That night, I pulled out a different folder, one I hadn't opened in years. Old agreements about water rights, easements, maintenance obligations tied to the road. Language that most people skim past because it's boring and dense and written by men who assumed their words would matter. Outside, the rain stopped. The valley went still, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. I traced a line on the map with my finger, following the road from the highway all the way up past the HOA gates, past the stone sign, past Marlene's deck with its perfect view. And for the first time since the sirens, I smiled. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I already knew this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It never was. The valley had become leverage, and leverage makes people careless when they think they own it. The HOA didn't back off after the deputies left. They doubled down. Notices escalated from warnings to deadlines. Language sharpened. Phrases like immediate compliance and enforcement action showed up in bold. A private security truck began idling at the mouth of the road some afternoons, its presence a silent threat. Every time I drove past, the driver stared straight ahead, pretending not to see me, pretending that pretending gave him authority. Marlene still hadn't spoken to me directly. People like her never do until they believe they've already won. She preferred intermediaries, lawyers, inspectors, anonymous emails dripping with concern about community safety. It was always framed as if she were doing me a favor. One evening, as I was stacking firewood, a black SUV crept up the road and stopped just short of the gate. The window rolled down an inch. "You need to understand," a man's voice said, smooth and practiced. "This doesn't have to get ugly." I leaned on the axe handle, listening to wind move through dry needles. "It already is," I said. The window rolled up. The SUV reversed slowly, tires crunching gravel, retreating like a threat that had decided to save itself for later. Here's something most people don't know. When powerful groups realize intimidation isn't working, they look for pressure points in your life that have nothing to do with the dispute. They call employers. They file nuisance complaints. They create noise where there was silence and hope you'll pay just to make it stop. My internet went out for 3 days. Then my water pressure dropped to a trickle. I found fresh locks on a utility box near the road, new, shiny, and very deliberate. That was the moment anger finally burned hot enough to focus me. I drove to the county record's office again, this time with a notebook full of questions. I asked about easements, about maintenance obligations, about liability when developments alter natural drainage. The clerk recognized me now. She didn't smile, but she lowered her voice. "You should talk to State Water Resources," she said. "And transportation, quietly." Quietly was my specialty. Over the next 2 weeks, I made calls from payphones and library desks. I asked questions that sounded naive on purpose. I let officials explain things to me like I was slow. People like to talk when they think they're teaching. Here's what I learned. The road wasn't just an access road. It was classified decades ago as a private agricultural corridor with shared emergency access status because it was the only route through the valley. That designation came with obligations. If you used it, you maintained it. If you damaged it, you were liable. And if you interfered with access, especially emergency access, you crossed from civil nuisance into something much more serious. Even more interesting was the water. The HOA's development had rerouted runoff into channels that fed directly into my watershed. The permits they'd pulled assumed responsibility for downstream impact. Responsibility they'd quietly tried to shift onto me by claiming the road, and therefore the drainage was theirs. It was elegant in a way, if it worked. The first real crack showed when an ambulance tried to get through. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was fixing a loose board on the porch when I heard sirens again, this time urgent. They hit the HOA gate and stopped. Radios crackled, voices raised. I drove down the road and arrived just in time to watch security argue with paramedics. A resident had collapsed. The gate code wasn't working. The security guard was waiting for authorization. I unlocked my gate and waved them through without saying a word. Later that night, my phone rang. Unknown number. "You endangered residents," Marlene's voice snapped, stripped of pleasantries at last. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said calmly, "and so did they." There was silence on the line, the kind where you can hear someone recalibrating. "You're making this worse for yourself," she said finally. "No," I replied. "I'm making it accurate." She hung up. The next letter from the HOA accused me of interfering with private security operations. I laughed out loud when I read it, the sound echoing in the empty cabin. Accuracy really was the enemy of arrogance. I compiled everything into a binder, not just my documents, but theirs. Photos of runoff channels, copies of permits, recorded voicemail threats, screenshots of smear posts. I labeled tabs carefully the way my father used to label seed jars. There was one night around 2 a.m. when doubt came back hard. Wind shook the windows, the lamp flickered. I stared at the binder and wondered if I was underestimating how ugly this could get, how deep their pockets were, how long they could drag it out. I thought about selling, walking away, letting them have it. Then I remembered my grandfather's hands, cracked and blackened, guiding mine along that road when I was a kid. I remembered him saying, "If you don't hold what's yours, someone else will decide it is." So I held. The county finally scheduled a joint inspection. Transportation, water resources, environmental protection. A small army of clipboards and boots showed up at the valley mouth one cold morning, breath fogging the air. Marlene was there too, immaculate, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She smiled at me like this was all theater she'd paid for. We walked the road. Officials asked questions. I answered simply. When Marlene interrupted, they asked her to wait her turn. That alone felt like a victory. At the bend by the river, the water resources officer stopped dead. He knelt, touched the soil, sniffed his fingers. "This isn't natural," he said. Up on the ridge, you could hear machinery start up like someone had realized too late they were being watched. By the end of the day, no conclusions were announced. Just notes, photos, promises of reports. Marlene cornered me as they packed up. "You think you're clever," she said quietly, venom wrapped in silk, "but this valley will belong to us one way or another." I met her gaze, felt the weight of years behind me. "It already belongs to itself," I said. "I just happened to be listening." That night rain came again, harder than before. Water roared down channels the HOA had cut, flooding sections of the road they claimed to own. I watched from my porch as runoff carved fresh scars into the hillside, carrying red clay straight into the river. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. Emails, voicemails. A notice of emergency injunction filed by the HOA accusing me of sabotaging infrastructure. I opened the binder, flipped to the back, and pulled out the last document I'd been saving. An old, nearly forgotten clause tied to the valley's designation as a protected watershed corridor. A clause that required any upstream development to submit to oversight by the downstream landholder. By me. Outside, helicopters thudded overhead, surveying flood damage. I poured myself coffee, sat at the table, and waited for the knock. The knock came just after sunrise, firm but not aggressive, the sound of knuckles that belonged to someone who already knew the door would open. I took my time. Let the coffee finish dripping. Let the valley settle after the helicopters had passed. When I opened the door, 3 people stood there, damp boots on the warped boards, badges half hidden under jackets. They weren't cops this time, they were state. The woman in front introduced herself first. Environmental oversight. The man beside her handled infrastructure compliance. The third said nothing at all, just scanned the cabin, the land, the road beyond my shoulder, eyes measuring slope and flow and age. The quiet ones always see the most. "We're here about the emergency injunction," the woman said. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was curious. "And about your watershed authority." I stepped aside and let them in. Inside, the cabin smelled like coffee and old pine. Papers covered the table, spread carefully, not chaotically. That mattered. People trust order. They sat. I poured mugs without asking. Steam curled up between us like a mediator. Here's something most people don't know. When agencies show up like this, early and in person, it means someone powerful has complained loudly enough to trigger attention, but not loudly enough to control the narrative. That window is small and precious. They asked me to explain everything from the beginning, so I did. I talked about my grandfather cutting the road by hand, about my father maintaining it every spring, about the valley designation nobody bothered to read because it didn't matter until money showed up. I slid documents across the table when words weren't enough. Deeds, maps, the clause about downstream oversight signed and sealed long before anyone had dreamed of stone entry signs and private security. The quiet man finally spoke. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. "I know what it should mean," I replied. He nodded once, satisfied. They stayed for 3 hours, walked the land, measured channels, took soil samples, watched water move the way it wanted to, not the way someone had tried to force it. When they left, they didn't promise anything. They never do. But they didn't look confused anymore. The HOA reacted exactly how you'd expect when a bully realizes the room is no longer empty. Lawyers called. Letters arrived overnight. A cease and desist accusing me of impersonating an authority I legally held. A demand for damages related to flood impact. They even tried to file a complaint claiming my cabin violated fire codes, hoping to get it condemned. That one hurt more than the rest. The cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was the last place my father sat quietly without a phone in his hand. The last place my mother laughed without pain. The thought of it being labeled unsafe, unfit, erased with paperwork, it almost broke my resolve. Almost. Instead, I drove to the fire marshal's office with blueprints older than the building itself and inspection records thicker than their accusations. He flipped through them, sighed, and shook his head. "They're throwing everything," he said. "Means they're scared." Back in the valley, the smear campaign went nuclear. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes downriver warning about contamination. Posts online accused me of holding emergency access hostage. Someone even called my employer from years ago trying to dig up something, anything, to use against me. It was loud, messy, desperate. And in the middle of it, something unexpected happened. People started showing up. Not officials, neighbors. A rancher from 2 valleys over stopped by with a box of apples and a quiet thanks. A retired teacher left a note at my gate saying she'd walked that road as a child and remembered when it was owned. Even a couple from the HOA itself came by one evening nervous, asking if it was true that emergency access depended on my road. I didn't gloat. I didn't rant. I just told the truth. That's the thing about leverage built on facts. It spreads on its own. The county scheduled a formal hearing. Public recorded, exactly the opposite of what Marlene wanted. She thrived in closed-door meetings and private threats. This would put her under lights. The night before, I barely slept. Rain tapped the roof. Wind pushed at the eaves. I lay there listening to the valley breathe and wondered if I'd pushed too far, not for myself, but for the place. Sometimes winning still costs something. In the morning, fog hung low, thick enough to muffle sound. I drove down the road slowly, past runoff scars, past survey flags, past the place where the ambulance had stalled weeks earlier. At the highway, traffic roared indifferent. I turned toward town, toward judgment. The hearing room smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters murmured. Marlene sat at the front with her legal team, posture perfect, lips tight. She didn't look at me. When my name was called, the room quieted. I spoke calmly, slowly. I explained the road, the water, the designations everyone had ignored. I introduced documents not as weapons, but as history. I let officials ask questions and answered them honestly, even when the answers complicated my own position. Marlene's attorney tried to paint me as obstructive, as uncooperative, as a lone holdout standing in the way of progress. That's when the infrastructure officer stood. "Progress," he said evenly, "does not include violating watershed protections or interfering with emergency access." The room shifted. You could feel it. Then the environmental oversight woman spoke, outlining preliminary findings: unauthorized runoff diversion, improper drainage mitigation, failure to adhere to downstream oversight requirements. Each phrase landed like a weight. Marlene finally turned and looked at me, not with anger, with disbelief. The hearing adjourned without a ruling, but the damage was done. Cameras caught the words. The narrative escaped her control. Outside, reporters asked me how it felt to take on a powerful HOA alone. "I wasn't alone," I said. "I had the valley." That afternoon, state notices went up at the HOA entrance. Construction halted pending review. Fines loomed. Required remediation orders stacked up like a future they hadn't budgeted for. The security truck disappeared. Marlene sent one last email that night, stripped of threats, asking to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat on the porch as dusk settled, the air cooling, the smell of wet earth rising again. For the first time in weeks, the valley felt quiet, not tense quiet, but resting quiet. I knew better than to think it was over. Power doesn't release its grip easily. It slips. It claws. It looks for a way to reframe loss as something else. And sure enough, 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived. Inside was a lawsuit, not against me, against the county, naming me as the reason. I read it once. Then again. Then I laughed long and loud, the sound echoing off the trees, because in their desperation, they'd made one final mistake. They'd forced the people who'd been quietly helping me to choose a side. And the valley, patient as ever, was about to make that choice very clear. The lawsuit hit the county like a slap in a quiet room. It wasn't loud at first. No headlines, no press conference, just a stack of papers filed late on a Friday, the way people do when they hope outrage will miss a weekend cycle. But counties don't forget being sued, especially not by an HOA that had already started to look careless under a microscope. By Monday morning, phones were ringing again, only this time not at my cabin. They were ringing downtown. I found out because the quiet man from infrastructure called me directly. He didn't introduce himself again. He didn't need to. They named you as a causal party, he said, which means everything you've documented becomes discoverable. I leaned back in the chair, listening to wind move through the trees outside. That good or bad? I asked. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a smile. That depends on how organized you are. I looked at the binders on the table, the labeled tabs, the logs, the photos, the dates. I'm very organized, I said. Here is something most people don't know. Lawsuits don't just expose facts, they expose behavior, patterns, emails people forgot they sent because they never expected anyone outside their circle to read them. When Marlene's legal team dragged the county into court, they opened a door that could never be closed again. Subpoenas went out like ripples in water. Internal HOA communications, developer emails, engineering memos, security reports. And because the lawsuit touched emergency access and environmental impact, federal agencies took interest too, quiet interest, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already seated at the table. The pressure shifted immediately. County inspectors returned to the valley, this time without clipboards visible, just cameras and GPS units. They measured everything, twice. They brought in independent hydrologists who didn't care about neighborhood politics. They asked questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Marlene started showing up more often. I'd see her SUV parked near the ridge, doors open, her pacing with a phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp enough to carry on the wind. Once she marched down the road toward my gate, heels sinking into gravel, face tight with a practiced fury. I met her there. Up close, she smelled like expensive perfume and stress. "You're enjoying this," she accused. "No," I said honestly. "I'm enduring it," she scoffed. "You think this ends with you sitting pretty in that shack while progress collapses?" I gestured around us at the trees, the river, the sky already starting to gray with afternoon clouds. "This was here before you," I said. "It'll be here after both of us." Her smile cracked then, just a hairline fracture, but I saw it. "You're not untouchable," she said quietly. I leaned on the gate, wood warm from the sun. "Neither are you," I replied. She turned and walked back up the road without another word, heels striking harder than necessary, each step a punctuation mark. That night I received an email from the county attorney. Short, direct. He asked if I'd be willing to provide sworn testimony and full access to my records. I agreed. The deposition was scheduled for the following week. I spent the days leading up to it walking the valley, not for strategy, my preparation was done, but for grounding. I followed the river's edge. I listened to water sliding over stones. I watched clouds build and break apart. When things get abstract and legal and heavy, it helps to touch what's real. The deposition room was smaller than I expected. No jury, just lawyers, a court reporter, and fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. Marlene sat across from me, eyes cold, posture rigid. Her attorney did most of the talking, voice smooth, questions designed to trip rather than clarify. They asked about my finances, my intentions. Whether I'd ever considered selling, whether I'd leveraged emergency access for personal gain. I answered carefully, simply, truthfully. No, over and over in different shapes. Then my attorney slid a folder across the table and asked if they'd like to discuss Exhibit F. Marlene stiffened. Exhibit F was an internal HOA email chain from before the first cop ever drove up my road. In it, Marlene explicitly discussed using code enforcement and emergency access claims to apply pressure and force compliance or exit. The room went quiet. Her attorney asked for a break. When they returned, the tone had changed. Questions softened. Lines of attack retreated. You could feel the momentum shift, subtle but unmistakable, like wind changing direction. Afterward in the hallway, Marlene didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, like someone holding back a scream. County moved fast after that. A preliminary injunction halted all HOA use of the road pending final determination of access rights and compliance obligations. Not just construction vehicles. Everyone, residents, vendors, guests, alternate access routes were proposed and rejected due to environmental impact and cost. Shuttle plans fell apart under logistical scrutiny. Suddenly, the stone gates and private security booths meant nothing without a way in or out. Residents panicked. Town halls erupted. HOA meetings turned hostile. Board members resigned, fingers pointed. Marlene tried to frame it as a temporary setback, but the cracks were visible now and cracks spread. I didn't celebrate. I maintained the road as I always had, graded it, cleared debris, allowed emergency vehicles through without question. When residents walked down to my gate asking for information, I answered them calmly. I never locked anyone out. That mattered. The press finally found the story. Not because I called them, but because lawsuits and blocked roads make noise. They came with cameras and questions and microphones. "Are you holding an entire community hostage?" one reporter asked. I looked into the lens and shook my head. "I'm holding a line that was crossed," I said. "There's a difference." The narrative stuck. Behind the scenes, the state issued formal findings. The HOA had violated multiple environmental protections. The developer had falsified drainage impact assessments. Remediation would cost millions. Fines loomed. Criminal referrals were whispered about. Marlene's name appeared in more than one memo. One evening, as dusk fell and the valley filled with that soft blue light that feels like forgiveness, a county vehicle pulled up to my cabin. The woman from environmental oversight stepped out, face tired but relieved. "It's going to be official soon," she said. "The road status, the oversight authority, all of it." I nodded, a weight lifting I hadn't realized I was carrying. "There's one more thing," she added. "The HOA is considering a settlement." I laughed quietly, not cruelly, just tired. "On whose terms?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Yours." That night I sat at the table with a blank legal pad and wrote down what I wanted. Not money, not apologies, protections, restoration, permanent easements guaranteeing emergency access under my maintenance, a conservation trust for the watershed funded by the HOA's own reserves. Marlene's removal from any position of authority related to land use. It wasn't revenge, it was correction. The response came 2 days later. They refused. Instead, they doubled down again, filing motions, appealing findings, dragging it out. Pride is expensive, but they still thought they could afford it. The state responded by escalating. Federal involvement was announced. That was the moment everything changed. I stood on the porch as clouds rolled in, heavy and dark, thunder rumbling in the distance. The smell of rain filled the air, sharp and clean. Down the road, far below, I could see the HOA entrance lights flicker on one by one, a row of artificial certainty glowing against an uncertain future. My phone buzzed with a text from the quiet man. "Be ready," it read. "Tomorrow will be loud." I closed my eyes, listened to the first drops of rain hit the roof, and waited. The thunder arrived before the sun. Not a crack, but a low, rolling sound that pressed against the valley like a warning. Rain followed in sheets, soaking the road, flattening dust, washing the air clean. I stood on the porch wrapped in my father's old jacket, listening to water find its way back to where it belonged. By mid-morning, the noise started. County trucks, state vehicles, then the ones you never see until they're already there, unmarked, quiet, efficient. The valley filled with engines and radios and boots on gravel. Clipboards were replaced with tablets. Conversations happened in low voices that didn't include Marlene. She arrived late. Her SUV stopped near the ridge, door opening and closing harder than necessary. She walked fast, posture stiff, heels abandoned for boots that still looked unused. When she saw the federal insignia on one of the jackets, her face drained of color so quickly it startled me. Here's something most people don't know. When federal agencies show up, the fight is already over. What's left is accounting. They didn't ask permission. They didn't ask opinions. They issued orders. Construction areas were cordoned off. Drainage channels were flagged for immediate remediation. Emergency access was formally rerouted under temporary state authority that deferred explicitly to my maintenance and oversight pending final settlement. Marlene tried to argue, tried to assert influence, tried to remind them who she knew. None of it landed. At one point, she turned and looked straight at me, eyes wide, searching for something. Sympathy, fear, gloating, anything she could use. I gave her nothing. The press showed up again, but this time the story had teeth. HOA development under federal review. Watershed violations trigger intervention. Private community faces sanctions. Residents gathered at the edge of the road, confused and angry and scared. Some recognized me, some didn't. I stood there anyway, answering questions, explaining what I could, never raising my voice. Calm spreads faster than panic if you give it room. By afternoon, the official notices were posted. Use of the road by the HOA was suspended indefinitely pending compliance and settlement. Emergency access guaranteed under state oversight with me listed, not as owner, but as steward. That word sat heavy and right in my chest. Marlene was escorted away from the site for interfering with federal operations. No cuffs, no spectacle, just a quiet instruction she couldn't refuse. Cameras caught her shouting anyway, voice shrill, control gone. The downfall wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. Over the next weeks, everything unwound. Emails leaked, not hacked, released through discovery. Messages where Marlene bragged about forcing out holdouts. Threads where board members worried about legality and were overruled. A memo from the developer acknowledging drainage risks and choosing to proceed anyway because downstream enforcement unlikely. People read those words and understood. The HOA board dissolved. Members resigned one by one. Lawsuits between residents and the association piled up. Insurance carriers withdrew. Property values dipped hard and fast. Marlene was named personally in multiple filings. Fines followed, then charges, not dramatic ones but serious enough. Misrepresentation, obstruction, environmental negligence. She never came back to the valley. The settlement happened quietly in a conference room I never set foot in. My terms, almost exactly as written, were accepted in full. The Watershed Trust was established. Funds were allocated to restore damaged areas and maintain the road properly under my supervision and state review. Emergency easements were recorded, permanent and unambiguous. The HOA entrance sign was removed, the stone repurposed for erosion control downriver. The gate stayed open until it was taken down entirely. Life didn't snap back to how it was before. It softened into something better. The road became what it had always been meant to be, used, respected, maintained without pretense. Neighbors waved when they passed. Sometimes they stopped to talk. Sometimes they brought coffee. Sometimes they just drove through the way roads are meant to allow. I fixed the cabin slowly, replaced boards, reinforced beams, not because anyone forced me to, but because I wanted it to last. One evening, months later, I walked the valley as the sun set, light spilling gold over water that ran clear again. The air smelled like wet stone and pine. Birds settled in for the night. I thought about how close I'd come to walking away. How easy it would have been to sell, to let paperwork erase a place that had held generations of my family. Power had tried to move quietly, counting on me to be smaller than it was. It had underestimated patience. Here's the last thing most people don't know. Justice isn't loud when it's real. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need revenge to feel complete. It restores balance and then steps back. The valley didn't need me to win. It needed me to listen. So I did. And in return, it stayed.